Hi,
How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm holding up. It's Monday.
Dara's arriving or what's going on? Or
Oh, she's here. She came last night,
oh,
but she's working from here today. She's not in the office.
oh, okay.
So she spends 90% of her time on Zoom calls and Zoom meetings. So we're both Zooming now.
I see.
She's in the
Okay.
dining room. I'm in the bedroom.
Uh, the Zoom ladies. Okay.
Yes, the Goroff Zooms.
Uh, mm,
Morning,
And I'm sitting
everybody.
trying to figure out how to copy and paste something from a document to a non-document type thing, to not an email, but if I think I can get an email and then email it to the person, or I'll just photocopy it and send it that way. Or I'll figure
I,
it out.
uh,
I'll get the genius in the other room to figure it out.
I was going to say she probably knows.
Yes.
Yeah, this is for work or
No, this is,
oh,
I had an incident when I was looking for a cat sitter, and I noticed on that neighborhood
yeah, yeah, I know
thing,
what you mean. Right.
somebody had a complaint about her. She wanted $25 because he called her. They
Mm.
never did. He called her to ask the price of something, and she got back to him, and I don't know if with the price or without, and then asked him for $25 for the,
For the
so said
consultation or
something.
whatever.
So I want to send him what happened with me and her,
Oh,
which
which
cost me $85.
uh, do
So
I know what happened? What, um, hmm.
she said she would cat sit, then she said she couldn't, so she got
Oh,
somebody
that
else,
one.
and yeah.
Right, right. I think
Good
the
morning, Rabbi.
good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning,
Good
Estelle.
morning, Estelle.
Lois,
Hey,
something
yes.
upsetting happened to me yesterday,
Oh,
Oh
no.
no,
which
because of
is
me.
that
Uh,
I did not because of you, but related to you. I did not notice a call from Susan
oh,
Van Dusen, over 2 weeks ago. Have you spoken to Susan in the past over 2 weeks?
um, I spoke to her
Since she
right
wasn't
when
well.
she got back. Right. I spoke to her
Oh, you
and
did?
then actually I rode over to her house. I mean, we didn't even talk. I wanted to get her book, but because the one she had brought for me, she had given to you that day.
Yeah.
Remember?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
and she wanted a book about Reb Nachman. So all we did, this was, I believe, last week. I handed her a book. She handed me a book, and that was it. But we didn't speak.
So she called me from the hospital. I feel so terrible. I only listened to the voicemail last night, like late last night. I did not notice it. I feel terrible because she was calling from the hospital and she was asking me to call you to let you know she was in the hospital.
Oh, really? Oh, well, I've
Yeah, and I
talked to her
feel
since
something.
then.
Okay.
Well,
All
you know
right.
what? Give her a call. She's home,
I will.
now.
I will.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
will. But
Oh,
yeah, she
yeah,
sounded terrible. She sounded just terrible.
she did. It
Yeah.
was the end of her trip. She was sick during the trip. And, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm glad you've been speaking to her. All righty then. Okay, so the last couple had to do with the Levium, and the last one we did was not giving the Levium their tithes, and also to not provide them with simcha on the holidays. So we talked a little about that. Okay, now he prohibited us. In other words, we are not allowed to claim debts on the sabbatical year, but rather we have to release them. For it is stated, every creditor that lends anything to his neighbor shall release it, he shall not exact it of his neighbor. We are only liable for this according to the Torah in the land of Israel at the time when the sabbatical of the land is operative, meaning the Jubilee. But rabbinically, one is liable for it in every place at every time. So it is not permissible to exact debts that have gone over the seventh year. Rather, one must release them, and the regulations of this commandment have already been explained in the laws of Shemitah. So this means that ever since there wasn't a Yovel, a Jubilee year, according to the Rambam, this law is only rabbinic, which means that at the time of Hillel, when he proposed Prusbul, it was I'm just going to check for sure to see here, but I'm pretty sure that there was no Yovel. Was the Jubilee year in practice? Hillel the Elder. Here it says, again, this is proximity, so we're getting a back of the envelope answer. However, by the lifetime of Hillel the Elder, who lived circa 110 to 10, the practical observance of the before the Common Era until 10 of the Common Era, he lived to be 120? No, minus 10. Minus 10. So he was 110 to 10, so he lived to be 100. The practical observance of the Jubilee had ceased. The cessation is connected with the view, articulated in post-exilic rabbinic interpretation, that Jubilee laws were only applicable when all 12 tribes of Israel lived in the land according to their tribal allocations. After the exile of the northern tribes, 722 before the Common Era, and certainly after further dispersions in foreign dominion, it was widely held that the biblical requirements for Jubilee observance no longer applied. This is evident in the most famous legal innovation by Hillel, the Prusbul. Hillel created this legal mechanism to allow debts to be collected even after the sabbatical year, because otherwise creditors would stop lending as the release of debts became essentially theoretical. If the Jubilee year had still been observed as binding law, the Prusbul would have been unnecessary, or at least far less relevant, since all debts would be canceled at the larger 50-year Jubilee reset. Therefore, while Hillel the Elder lived in a period that sustained the memory and theoretical idea of the Jubilee, it was not in practical or institutional observance during his lifetime. All right, so here's the thing. if the Jubilee, if the Yovel is not in practice, according to the Rambam, Shemitah is rabbinic. According to the Rambam, Shemitah is rabbinic now. And that means that, yeah, so why does that matter? Because if Shemitah is rabbinic, then the fact that Hillel came up with Prusbul is not such a dramatic idea. It was already only a rabbinic law. And he, you would think, if he's coming up with some kind of a end around for a rabbinic law, that would not be as shocking to people. But typically, that's not how it's explained. Typically, this comes up as one of these examples of a rabbinical workaround a biblical law. But according to the Rambam, that would have never been the case, because according to the Rambam, this issue of Shemitah not being able to collect debts is dependent on Yovel, and Yovel was not happening during the time of Hillel, which means that his entire thing of Prusbul is only happening with rabbinic law. Have you ever heard that be an answer to that question of how he could come up with Prusbul? Prusbul is like cited as one of these, points of contention with regard to the power of the Sanhedrin to overcome biblical law. But according to the Rambam, it's not overcoming biblical law. It's only overcoming rabbinic law. All right, one more thing here. Why is Prusbul cited by some as an example of the rabbis creating a workaround for a biblical when, according to Maimonides, was only rabbinic during the time of Hillel. Now, there may have been a time when I knew this, but I don't know it. Yeah, so why? According to the Gemara and Maimonides, Prusbul did not cancel the Torah mitzvah itself, but worked around the rabbinic enactment because the sabbatical year was only enforced by rabbinic decree at the time. Thus, Prusbul is seen as a rabbinic solution to a rabbinic law. It does not overrule a Torah commandment, but modifies how it is applied due to dot, 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 dot. Yeah, so how is that why isn't that the obvious? Do you know how many times this comes up in discussions about Rose Bowl? Rose Bowl. All right, let's look at this puppy. Rose Bowl. Let's see. Rabbi Shlomo Levi, translated by David Strauss. Prus Bowl. At the end of the Shemitah year, all debts that have come to term are canceled. Therefore, creditors are accustomed to draw up a Prus Bowl on Erev Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, such as this year on the eve of 5769, in order to prevent the remission of their debts. The Mishnah in Shvius explains, a Prus Bowl prevents the remission of debts in the Shemitah year. This is one of the regulations made by Hillel the elder, for he saw that people were unwilling to lend money to one another, disregarding the warning laid down in the Torah, beware lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your needy brother, and you give him nothing. He therefore decided to institute Prus Bowl. The text of the Prus Bowl is as follows. I hand over to you so-and-so, the judges in such and such a place, my bonds, so that I may be able to recover any money owed to me from so-and-so at any time I shall desire. And the Prus Bowl was signed by the judges or witnesses. The Rambam rules Prus Bowl is only effective regarding Shemitah in our time, which is a rabbinic decree. But when Shemitah is a Torah law, Prus Bowl is not effective. Hilchos Shemitah B'Yovel 9:16. The Raavad disagrees, arguing that according to Rava, the enactment of Prus Bowl applies even when Shemitah is by Torah law, based on the rule of Hefker based in Hefker, the court's authority to divest a person of his assets. And this year, I wish to summarize some of the principal points dealt with by the poskim regarding Prus Bowl. How does Prus Bowl work? The Mishnah in Shvi states, one who lends money against a pledge and one who hands his bonds over to the court, the debt is not released. The source for this law is found in the Sifrei, the Halachic Midrash, which states, and whatsoever of yours is with your brother shall your hand release, but not one who hands his bonds over to the court. According to the Sifrei, the mitzvah of debt remission applies to individuals, but not to the court. Rashi and Tosfot disagree about how to understand Prus Bowl. Regarding one who hands his bonds over to the court, Rashi writes, this is the Prus Bowl instituted by Hillel. Tosfos, however, comment, this does not seem right. Therefore, it seems that there are two different things. One who hands over his bonds to the court, it is by Torah law that the debts are not released. Tosfos understands that according to Rashi, one who writes a Prus Bowl is regarded as if he had handed over his bonds to the court. Thus, there is a correspondence between the two laws, and just as Prus Bowl is an enactment instituted by Hillel, so too one who hands over his bonds to the court. According to this understanding, which is accepted understanding of Rashi's position, the derivation from the biblical verse in the Sifrei regarding one who hands over his bonds to a court is merely an asmakta support for the law, but not really its source. On this point that Tosfot disagree and say that the law governing one who hands over his bonds to the court is biblical in authority. According to Tosfos, the question arises, what need was there for Hillel's enactment if handing over bonds to a court prevents the remission of debts by Torah law? The Rishonim offered two explanations of the enactment. The Sefer HaTrumot, cited by the Beit Yosef, writes, a prisbal is only by rabbinic decree, and it is effective only in our time and in an important court. For he does not actually hand over his bonds to the court, but rather he writes or says to the court, I hand over. That is to say, if a person actually hands over his bonds to the court, the debts recorded therein are not released during the Shemitah year by Torah law. But a person who writes a prusbul merely writes a deed in which he informs the court that he is handing over his bonds. Since he doesn't actually hand the bonds over, it is only because of Hillel's enactment that the debts are not released. That's according to the Sefer HaTrumot. The Tosfot and Tosfos Harosh and Gittin suggest that prusbul is indeed regarded as handing over the bonds to the court, and therefore it is indeed effective by Torah law. But in the time of Hillel's enactment, people rarely handed over their bonds to a court because the practice was regarded as a circumvention of the law of debt remission during the Shemitah year. For this reason, the courts refused to accept the bonds. By instituting that the court should accept the bonds, Hillel legitimized the practice and made it available to whoever wished to make use of it. All right, so why am I bringing this up? So I'm bringing this up because over the years, and especially when it comes to issues where there is disagreement between Orthodox scholars and conservative scholars, conservative Jewish scholars, you have this issue will come up. Does a Sanhedrin, do the rabbis have a right to actively overcome a biblical law? So, for instance, let's take as an example, driving on Shabbos. So there was a decision by the leadership of the leading rabbinic figures of the conservative movement to permit driving a car on Shabbos to synagogue and back. Now, in the discussion of this, the assumption was that driving a car is a violation of biblical law because the gas fumes are ignited by sparks, and so that constitutes lighting a fire on Shabbos. And there may be other reasons too, but that's one of them. So driving a car involves a biblical violation on Shabbos. So, there was, the feeling was that there are more and more people who are missing out on synagogue life, and synagogue life is absolutely imperative for to sustain the Jewish community and Jewish life, and therefore it amounted to a kind of almost like an emergency circumstance, and therefore they decided to permit driving on Shabbos. Again, I am summarizing it. There's obviously a lot of detailed thought that went into this. This was considered unacceptable within Orthodox circles. The reasoning was considered unacceptable, and the feeling was that there is no authority for any rabbinic body to permit something like driving on Shabbos, to permit actively violating Shabbos, even if you have a good cause after it. And so in the ensuing discussions about this and certain other decisions of this came up in the discussion of patrilineal descent, which is something the conservative movement did not agree with, together with the Orthodoxy. But it was the Reform movement in America. Even the Reform movement in Canada did not agree with this. The Reform movement in Israel, which are both very small, did not agree with this. But it was the decision of the Reform movement in America to determine Jewishness based on both matrilineal and patrilineal descent. So if somebody had either a Jewish father or a Jewish mother, they are considered Jewish at birth and they don't require a conversion. Again, there were some more qualifications about this, but that was the basic thing. So again, in this discussion as well, one of the subjects that came up is prusbul. So both when the discussion about driving on Shabbos comes up or patrilineal descent comes up, at some point you will hear people bring up prusbul as an example of when the rabbis permitted actively violating the Torah because of some sociological concern. The sociological concern, as quoted in the Mishnah, was that
People
would
won't
stop.
lend money.
Yeah, they weren't
Right.
lending money. I'm just trying to see
Right.
if it was. Oh, here it is. For he saw that people were unwilling to lend money to one another, disregarding the warning laid down in the Torah. Beware lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, saying, "The seventh year." Blah 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 blah. Okay, so there was a sociological concern, and Hillel permitted the overriding of the active overriding of a biblical law because of a sociological concern, which is again what the conservative movement was doing by permitting driving, and perhaps what the reform movement was doing by changing how to define Jewishness. The sociological concern there was that there's so much intermarriage and there's so many potential Jews. If we would just include patrilineal descent. So both of them are arguing that because of a kind of sociological emergency, it is okay for a rabbinic body with authority, which they each considered the rabbinic bodies of their movement to have such authority, like the Sanhedrin, which itself is a matter of discussion. But in other words, it's not out of bounds for leadership to take sociological concerns into consideration and allow for the active overriding of biblical law. So this is often the case that's cited. And the thing is that, so how do you explain how they could do it? So one answer to how they could do it is the Rambam. The Rambam holds that Shemitah in the time of Hillel was rabbinic. And therefore, he's not overcoming biblical law when he gives this directions to do the prusbul. He's overcoming rabbinic law, which a court can have the right to do. Again, it depends on their number and on their wisdom. We talked about this a few weeks ago. So it doesn't apply it wouldn't apply according to the Rambam. This whole question would not help if you're talking about permitting driving on Shabbos because of a sociological concern, because driving on Shabbos amounts to a biblical infraction. If
Rabbi?
it does, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about that. So the things that are forbidden on Shabbos, it says specifically about fire, okay?
Yeah.
If you have one of the other ones, one of the 37, 39, and let's say that there's a reason, I can't think of one now, that you would like to institute something that would be okay. because that isn't specifically in the Torah and it was formed by the rabbis, you could use this?
No, those laws, even though they're not specifically mentioned in the Torah, they have the status of biblical law. All the 39 categories have the status of biblical law. That rabbinic law means that they are the rabbis are legislating it. In the case of the like something like Shabbos, the 39 categories, there you would call it either possessing oral tradition already. In other words, that it's been oral law from the beginning, or interpretation of biblical sources. So, and we spoke about this. Even if you use something like one of the 13 methods that are taught by Rabbi Yishmael, even if you apply those to a pasuk and get a result, the end result is considered to have the same status of biblical law as other biblical law. But certainly, if it's part of the oral tradition, in other words, it's not simply learned through these methodologies, but we consider them to be bearers of the oral tradition. So something that is from the oral tradition from the beginning also has the status of biblical law, and it has the same status as stuff that's found in the written Torah. And so Shabbos is considered to be like that. The 39 categories are all considered to be biblical. Yeah, but in this case,
Okay.
you're right. I mean, lighting a fire is one of only really two, or not two. I think there's three Shabbos laws that are overtly mentioned in the Torah. One is carrying an object from one domain to another. One is cooking on Shabbos, and the other is lighting a fire. Those are the only ones that are mentioned overtly, but all 39 are considered to have the same status. So, but yeah, so again, if somebody would bring this case up as support for, let's say, part of the support for the decision to allow for driving on Shabbos, one answer you could give is, for the Orthodox position, is that according to the Rambam, and this seems to be how we paskin, by the way, this seems to be how we halachically paskin, which is that Shemitah nowadays is rabbinic. And since Shemitah is rabbinic, and it was rabbinic at his time, because Yovel was not, according to the Rambam, if Yovel is not in practice, Shemitah is only rabbinic, and Yovel was not in practice during his time. So he's only allowing for the overcoming of a rabbinic law, not a biblical one. So it couldn't be used as a source for the notion that you can overcome biblical law for a societal need. That doesn't mean there isn't other areas to talk about, but this is often brought up. So that's according to the Rambam. Now, there are others who do consider, who do suggest that Prusbul would even work if it was a biblical law. But even there, it could work for it. In other words, it's possible, the way he was just explaining Tosfos, the way he was just explaining the Tosfos's opinion. According to Tosfos, Okay, let's see here. I just want to see here 1 second. Tosfos and Tosfos Harosh. Yeah, so according to them, this is not a rabbinic, an example of rabbinic decree overcoming a biblical one. This is an example of a rabbinic decree essentially permitting a biblical way of dealing with the biblical law. So what it means is this: even when Shemitah was biblical, there were two ways in which you could guarantee that you'll still be able to collect this loan even after Shemitah. So again, the rule is that when Shemitah ends, you are no longer allowed to collect loans that were owed to you before. But there are two exceptions. One exception is that you collect collateral for the loan. That is one exception, if you take collateral for the loan. The second exception to the biblical law is if you actually hand the debt over to the courts. Because when you hand the debt over to the courts, it's the courts collecting it. It's not you collecting it. Now, technically, the courts are collecting it for themselves. But if they want to, they could give it to you. There's nothing that prevents them from giving it to you. So if you hand your debts over to the court, you don't need a biblical enactment, a rabbinic enactment to be able to collect it. That already suffices without any requirement of Hillel to intervene. So nobody needed to intervene in cases where there was collateral or in cases where somebody handed over their debts to the court. Again, when you say handed over the debts to the court, it means you're giving the debts over. They're now their debts. You know, like people talk about selling debt. Nowadays, you can sell debt or buy debt. So this would be an example of handing over debt, giving over debt. But once you gave it over, it is now owed to the court. And that did not need Hillel. That was something you could do because it works on a biblical level. So the only question is, what did Hillel do if that's the case? Because if handing over your debts did not require Hillel, then why do we need Prusbul? So there's two possible answers. One possible answer is that Prusbul does not amount to handing over your debt to the court. If you want to hand over your debt to the court, you actually have to do that. You have to go to the court and hand over all your debts to the court. The Prusbul is saying is making a declaration that you do that, but it's not. So the rabbinic, what Hillel is saying is that we're going to treat this as if you handed it over. That's a rabbinic help in this thing, because we're saying that even though technically you didn't hand it over, we're considering it like you handed it over. Once we consider it like you handed it over, now you're allowed to collect your debt. The other way of understanding it is that, and this apparently is the Tosfos way of understanding it. You're right. This actually is considered to be handing over your debts. When you write that Prusbul, it's the same thing as if you handed over your debts, even biblically. So why do we need Hillel? You need Hillel because people weren't doing it. In his time, people considered it iffy proposition. They consider it trying to get out of what the Torah wants you to do. And therefore, people, even though it was technically permitted, people didn't want to do it. And what Hillel's telling them is, you got to do it. I need you to do it because people are stopping to lend money. So he's just encouraging people to use a permit that already existed according to the Torah. So here you have, several different responses to Prusbul, which according to these would, even though this isn't about, they're not overtly discussing the question of other cases of transgressing biblical law for the sake of social needs. They're just trying to understand Prusbul. They're just trying to understand what happened there. So according to this, you have the Rambam who says that the whole thing's rabbinic to begin with. And by the way, again, that seems to be how we paskin. If you go to Israel now during the Shemitah year, and you see the farms that are not working their land, we paskin that is a rabbinic enactment, and that it's rabbinically that they're not working their land. That biblically the law is not in effect, and this would also be the case with the loans, with what do you call it, of loans? A forgiving of loans. So either it's rabbinic or it's because it's already working within the bounds of a biblical something that was considered even in a time when it was biblically effective to work biblically, and that is handing your documents, your loans over to the court. Okay.
So if Yovel came back, it wouldn't
Then it's going to be, so according to the Rambam,
problem, right?
according to
It
the
would be
Rambam,
a problem for the Rambam, but it wouldn't be a problem for the others,
right,
right?
correct. According
Right.
to either Rashi or Tosfos, it would not be a problem, but it would be according to the Rambam. But it does seem like the Rambam, yeah. So even if Yovel came back, you could still, if we held like Tosfos or Rashi, then
You just
you'd
give it to
still
the
have
court.
it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All
Yeah.
right. So that is that. I'm glad we had a chance to study together today. I look forward
Rabbi,
to doing
I
it
just
tomorrow.
want to say before
Yeah.
you leave that don't worry about, when I did talk to Susan, when I called her, she never mentioned that you were supposed to call her. So, there's no
Yeah,
problem.
it's just, if you heard her voice when she called, she
I
felt
can
like,
imagine.
yeah,
Yeah.
I feel,
So
okay, but
sorry.
thank you.
Anyway,
Thank you
give her
for-
a call.
Okay, I
Okay.
will. I
All
will.
right.
Thank
See you
thank
tomorrow.
you, Rabbi.
All right. Bye-bye, Estelle. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Liz. Okay.